This is The Secret Library, a podcast about writing and publishing books. I'm Caroline Donahue, a life coach who works with writers, and I'm here to tell you this is your year. It's time to stop waiting and start writing. The Secret Library podcast is brought to you in part by support from listeners like you. You can learn about how to contribute via the Secret Library podcast Patreon at patreon.com/secretlibrary. This is episode 145 of the Secret Library podcast. My guest this week is Akiko Busch. She writes about design, culture, and nature for a variety of publications. She was a contributing editor at Metropolis magazine for 20 years, and her essays have appeared in numerous national magazines, newspapers, and exhibition catalogs. Currently, she is on the faculty of the MA Design Research program at the School of Visual Arts, and she is a visiting teacher at Bennington College, where she teaches environmental writing. Her most recent book, How to Disappear, came out in 2019. She's also the author of The Incidental Steward, Geography of Home, Writings on Where We Live, The Uncommon Life of Common Objects, Essays on Design in the Everyday, and 9 Ways to Cross a River, Midstream Reflections on Swimming and Getting There from Here. She lives in the Hudson Valley and makes it a point to swim across the Hudson River once a year. I knew I wanted to have Akiko as soon as I found out about How to Disappear. I think one of the biggest challenges we face as writers is balancing the need to be visible as well as the need to step away from visibility. There's so much pressure nowadays to have a public face, to share much more of our lives, to be more vulnerable to the public eye. And at the same time, writing is difficult to do when you're focused on the outside world. You have to step away. You have to spend time alone. You have to reflect on what's happening internally. So it was an honor and a privilege to speak to Akiko about what she discovered in writing How to Disappear, both the topics that she found as well as the process of writing about disappearance itself. I think you're going to love hearing from her as much as I did. Hi, Akiko. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I think I was hooked as soon as I saw the title, of course, because thinking about the process of needing to disappear as a writer, and also this sort of change that we've seen in what it means to be a writer and how we have to promote ourselves, is a topic I think is on many people's minds. But there's also the aspect of people who are sort of disappeared and aren't allowed to appear in the first place. And so this concept of wanting to disappear, but also just the control that people want to have over visibility, whether they choose to be seen or not, or all of those things are such complicated topics. And so I was eager to talk about both how you researched the book and created the book, but also the subject itself and how it has impacted you as a writer of many books and essays.
Oh, okay, there's a lot there. I'm not sure exactly where to start. But there's a lot there.
Fair enough. I think maybe I'll start at the beginning. What drew you to the topic of disappearing? What was the initial impulse to write about the book? And what did you learn as you were diving in? Because you cover many areas, not just kind of public life, but also the ways it impacts nature, and you go through the wide gamut. So what drew you into the concept of disappearing first?
Well, okay, let's see. Start at the beginning. We all live to see and be seen. We know this. Being seen, being recognized, being acknowledged is vital to human experience. Social visibility is vital to our happiness, to our sense of ourselves, and when it diminishes, we suffer. The gaze is vital to human connection and interaction. The Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter have the power they do today because it's their aim to put populations often unseen and unrecognized back into social and political visibility. We all need to see each other. This is the given. This is the default position from whence we start. But it seemed to me that at the same time, I kind of have this conviction about the imperative to go unseen, to be inconspicuous, to be invisible, that these are just as critical. And I think this is something that we've tended to lose sight of, as it were, today in an age of transparency when, in this kind of increasingly visual culture, social media and surveillance economy tend to put a kind of disproportionately high value on public identity. So I wanted to look at various iterations of remaining unseen as a positive experience. I wanted to look at various parts of human experience in which being unseen and unrecognized could be an advantage, could do you good, could do good to this human psyche. So that's kind of where I began, and I began. The obvious place to begin is in the natural world, where camouflage and remaining hidden and remaining out of sight can be, a circumstance of great power and even survival. But then, beyond that, obviously I wanted to go beyond that. But that is where I started.
I think it's really fascinating because there is this lack of agency, I think so many people feel, with whether or not they are seen. And in some ways, that was what struck me going through the book, that we as writers there was a reputation of being a writer, that you would get to go and hide and be left alone. And now there's this different relationship to it where you're expected to have a giant following and you're expected to have this huge presence in order to justify getting a book published or your writing being there. And that didn't used to be the case with the world of writing.
Well, I think what you're saying is really true, but I think that's kind of an assumption that maybe isn't quite as true as we may think it is. I think for some writers, the idea that you have to have X number of Instagram followers is important. And certainly your publisher and marketing director might be very, very happy if you have hundreds and thousands of Instagram followers. That's going to help you sell your book. But I think the assumption that is what writers must do is a little faulty. I just don't think we all have to buy into that, I guess, is what I'm saying.
I hope not. I'm grateful to hear that we wouldn't. And I think that in what you're talking about, that it's just as important to go unseen and to be able to observe without putting oneself in the spotlight. I think we live in a time when our kind of visual presence is so important, whether you're talking about social media or the surveillance economy, but, it just seems like how we define ourselves in the public realm is increasingly important to our ideas of ourselves and how we kind of form these ideas we have of ourselves. But, I think you can step back from that and realize that maybe all is not lost if you step back. And if you don't have that kind of really super visible public identity, it's okay. It's not really damaging. And in fact, it can be quite sustaining. Yes. So how was your relationship to being visible versus invisible changed by the process of writing this book?
That's interesting. How did it change? I'm not sure it changed a lot. I live in the country. I live in a very rural area. I have a little office kind of tucked away at the top of our hill at the edge of the woods, and that's where I do my work. For a long time, I didn't have an internet connection up here. So, of course, that became impossible once, when I'm doing any kind of research, obviously, you need to go online. So I eventually did get a Wi-Fi connection. And, I sometimes think of going back. There's something I think about. Well, maybe it depends on what kind of writing you do, but I think that there are times when I wish I could be up here in my office and not have that constant distraction because, like so many people, I'm susceptible. I'm checking the news and I'm checking the email, and I'm, if I find an interesting bit of research, I go down that rabbit hole, and suddenly it's 20 minutes later, and I kind of wonder, what it would be like to go back where I wasn't so connected. Where would it be? And please understand, I'm not advocating disconnection. I'm not advocating going off and being, disconnecting from the world outside. That's not what I'm saying at all. Because I think, as I began by saying, being seen and seeing one another and having this human connection is vital to all of us. But in terms of work, there are times when I think, maybe I don't need that internet connection up here. Maybe my writing, maybe the way, not my writing, but my thinking would be more enhanced, would be less distracted if I didn't have that connection up here. But I have not yet taken that leap. So it's at the moment, it's kind of wishful thinking.
Yeah, I think it's always this tension. Like, we have these tastes of it. I remember spending time in Big Sur, where there is notoriously very bad service. And you can only, at the time that I went and was working on a little bit of writing, you could go to the Henry Miller Library and use their unbelievably slow internet connection if you needed to get in touch. And the level of depth I got out of reading and the thinking that I got in that period of time has also made me think, what if there was a period of time during the day when the internet just didn't work and then you could work on other things? I think these thought experiments are interesting to say, how would this change my work life? How would this change if I was able to disappear for periods of time, either every day or every week?
Absolutely. I think we probably all share that. All of us inhabitants of the digital age, of when you go to a place where there's slow service or no service, you're kind of inconvenienced for the first 7 minutes, and then it's like, oh, this just feels great, So I think that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you expanded out from nature and then looked into this experience of invisibility in your life and in your family's life and spreading out over the world, what were some experiences that really struck you most profoundly?
Well, I probably, because I grew up in a really beautiful place, which is New York's Hudson Valley. It's a really beautiful wooded area close to the river. I'm very, kind of connected to the landscape and the geography of where I live. And so for a long time, my writing was really place-based. I mean, I would often use landscape or geography as a way to enter an idea or to talk about something. It wasn't that I was necessarily writing about landscape, but it was kind of my entry point into a more abstract idea. And that kind of writing, place-based writing, has always been something really important to me and something that I really love doing. So even when I'm thinking about an abstract idea, if I can come at it through place, that's what really works. So when I knew that I was going to be writing this kind of book, multiple chapters and many ideas and coming at it from different directions, I knew that in areas where I could, writing about place would be really important. So in this book, there are a couple of chapters that are really rooted in place. And one of those is about Iceland, a trip I took to Iceland, which I knew from the very beginning I wanted to do. In Iceland, there is a kind of ancient belief in something called the Huldufolk, which is an entire hidden population, a population of invisible people. And the Huldufolk are they're human beings. They're just not seen, and they're like us, only they're a little bit better, so they're a little bit more attractive than we are. They look a little bit nicer. Their horses have sleeker coats and run faster. Their cows give richer milk and cream. I mean, it's this really wonderful concept of sort of, our better selves. But they're unseen. And there's this kind of acceptance of, this unseen population that's kind of, just kind of living around the corner. So I was really fascinated by that. I was really interested in what it's like to go through life, thinking about this parallel population that you just don't see. So that was one of my favorite parts of the research was going to Iceland and looking at the landscape, this fantastic landscape of kind of lunar rocks and moss and lava fields and, whole huge black lava fields planted with the purple lupin. I mean, just these fantastically beautiful landscapes that were nothing like I'd ever seen, and that were apparently inhabited by this invisible population. So that was a trip I really loved. Another part of the research I did was I had never been scuba diving. And I have a good friend who's a biologist. Yeah, she's a biologist, and she researches coral. She's researching coral reefs off the Grand Cayman Islands. So she invited me to go down because she talked really beautifully, really articulately about what it is to be underwater. And it's where she's doing really her most important work and her most important research. But she talks about, kind of losing her sense of material self and, swimming down there, being submerged and being completely invisible and unnoticed by the sort of neon residents of that aquatic bazaar, all those beautiful bright fish and invertebrates, and you just kind of are in that world, and they're oblivious to you, and you're not paying too much attention to them, and it's just, it's a kind of an absorption by place that's not possible above the surface of the water, right? I mean, if you're walking in the woods, I mean, the animals are aware of you, you're aware of them, but underwater, that whole equation really changes. So I was interested in that. I mean, she talks about doing her best work when she's feeling invisible. So that was really fascinating to me. So those two trips I took, one to Iceland and then the other one to go scuba diving, those I kind of saw as being the kind of place-based writing that I really love to do. But there were other areas of the book that were much more abstract, where I couldn't kind of affix the ideas to place. And those were really important. I mean, I had to really confront those ideas and, kind of just deal with them. But I didn't have the geography to kind of use as an entryway. So there was I was talking about the invisibility that women sometimes feel as they grow older. Mm-hmm. And that led me to reread Mrs. Dalloway, because, Mrs. Dalloway begins with this beautiful section where Clarissa Dalloway is walking down this London street, unnoticed, unseen, unobserved. And she talks about how women, especially, women when you're beyond childbearing, you're only known by your husband's name. You're not seen. You're identified by your gloves or, by your hat or by something you're wearing, but that you're not really seen. And then she talks about, how that, I mean, she's feeling a little bit, she's not feeling really great about that. But then she realizes that she's able at her age to feel this greater empathy with the people around her. And she's feeling in an odd way, kind of more socially connected, more affiliated. And it's a really beautiful kind of meditation. So, that section of the book was really just really deeply rereading Virginia Woolf, right? Mm. So that was a completely different kind of research, but that was, just as satisfying in its own way. So yeah, the different ways I researched this book really varied from rereading to traveling to unexpected places.
I think that seems like the most satisfying kind of book to write, in that you're not just doing one thing and you're not just reading one kind of thing. And I think that's one of the beautiful ideas of taking a slightly more abstract idea and thinking about, okay, how am I going to find situations that articulate this more concretely?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's, I think for people who write nonfiction, that it's really important to know that. I mean, I think most people who write nonfiction do know that. But if you haven't written nonfiction, you're thinking about it. I think it's really important to remember that. I mean, and this is something I try to talk to my students about, which is that writing, and especially in nonfiction, but writing is a really associative process. I mean, for me, it's really important to sit down and have some idea of what I'm saying, some structure, some sense of an outline, some sense of where I'm going with an idea. But at the same time, there's something that happens when you sit down and start to write, whether it's longhand or at a keyboard. There's something in that associative process. There's something in the kind of, hand-brain connection, and I don't know what it is. It's almost ineffable, but there's something that happens. And when you start to write, your mind goes in really unexpected directions, and that's when digressions are really important. You're writing something and you just find yourself going someplace you hadn't thought you were going to go. And I think paying attention to that is really important. I mean, it can be really sustaining and really, not to get too dramatic, but, really kind of empowering to find yourself going in a completely unexpected direction. And I think, I just think that that's one of those weird things that happens to the human imagination when you're writing. It's just these unexpected turns. And I think it's important to respect that and to follow it.
I think it's essential. I think you're absolutely right. And I think
Yeah.
having this idea, so you had this initial impulse about, okay, well, maybe being invisible can be a powerful and positive experience. How many ideas did you have, like the trip to Iceland or potentially scuba diving or other areas in nature and so on, that where you maybe had early on, but how many did you find, like you're saying, that as you started to write about the experiences that you had, there were all of these other associations that came up?
Well, yeah. Okay. So a couple of things about that. And the first is, and I don't know, I think this happens to other nonfiction writers. But especially in a book like this, where it's really kind of an abstract idea that you're trying to structure and organize, and where am I going to put this piece of information, and where am I going to put that experience? There was a huge. It was a problem for me to know when to begin, because it's not like you sit down and do the research and say, oh, okay, now I'm done with the research. Now I'm going to write. I mean, you're kind of writing and putting ideas together, and you're kind of doing your research, but you don't know, or it was hard for me to know exactly when to sit down and start to write the book. And I think a mistake early on that I made was starting to write it a little bit too soon, because I was so excited by some of the things I was finding and, some of the ideas, and kind of once I started to think about this, what was out there, that as a writer, that's the reward. That's what you want to do, is you want to sit down and start writing and putting all this together. And I did that a little bit too soon. So I'd written this one chapter early on that I later just had to take apart completely and kind of take it apart and put different sections in other different chapters, because it was just, there were way too many ideas, and they weren't really connecting. And it just, the right things were there, but they were all in the wrong place. So that was one thing, was beginning too soon. But then another thing was, I went to Iceland, and I went diving in the Cayman Islands, and I read Mrs. Dalloway, and, the book was kind of coming together. And then I realized that, I was really missing the piece, which was, and this was sort of as I was kind of midway through, or kind of thinking about where I was going to end up with this book. And I realized that I was missing the whole, a section about neuroscience and those, the way because I was very interested in the way the brain and body can sometimes detach from one another. I mean, there's a lot of technology. You put on the virtual reality glasses or whatever it is, and you have this experience, this kind of disembodied experience. And I felt that was important to the conversation about invisibility. But then I realized when that happens involuntarily, there are certain kinds of disorders, stroke, dementia, Alzheimer's. There are different brain disorders in which that happens involuntarily and cause great suffering and great sadness. And, so what does that mean? I felt that in my, my kind of infatuation, my love affair with invisibility, I wasn't really paying close enough attention to those experiences in which people tend to disappear because of some kind of neurological disorder. So I felt that I had to look at that. And fortunately, I was able to find some neuroscientists who were, willing to speak to me really as a non-scientist and kind of talk me through some of these ideas in ways that I could really understand. So that was an area that I hadn't really expected to encounter, but that I ended up being really important.
Yes, definitely. I think there's a way that this book feels a little bit like a quilt to me, like that there were patches and then certain colors, they come back in different themes and you see them connect in different ways. And when you said that you had all the right pieces, but they were in the wrong places, I had this image of you taking quilt patches and kind of reorganizing them so that the pattern came together.
Oh, that's exactly what I had to do, certainly with that first chapter. And it's nice to see you say the pattern came together because I was just never quite sure. But there were parts of that very first chapter I wrote that I ended up, using in the last chapter of the book. So, I knew from the beginning, I did know from the beginning that the experience of wonder and awe was going to be part of this book. I mean, I had done enough reading and enough thinking about this to know that where I was probably going to end up at the end of the book was with this idea of the small self, and that when people, when your identity is diminished, when you feel small, as in the experience of wonder and awe, then you're kind of your kind of social consciousness grows. You start to see yourself as part of a collective. You start to see yourself as part of a human community. And I felt that was, I felt that was a really important point. And I was pretty sure that's where I was going to end up with this book. And I did. That is, in fact, where I ended up. But when I began to write the book at the very beginning, I kind of used some of those ideas at the beginning. And I said, I ultimately realized, no, you want to get to this much more slowly. You don't want to throw this idea out at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. You said something I find fascinating a moment ago, which is that you feel that you started writing too soon. And for those listening, I wonder, people who are writing in nonfiction, also, I think there may be a danger as well that you can become so enraptured with researching all of the ideas that be connected to an idea that it would also be possible to start writing too late. So how did you know when it was the right time to start writing? When did it feel like, okay, I'm actually in the right place now?
Oh, boy, I don't know. That's really a good question. I mean, these books, these projects, kind of, it's so easy for them to take on a kind of timeline of their own, that you sort of have to respect. I think for me, it was just, and I would suspect for most writers that, that temptation to jump in because you just feel like you found so much wonderful material, that kind of impulse to jump in and start is what can sort of be your undoing. And then you sort of step back and say, no, this is too soon. And then maybe you wait too long on the other end. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly when you know what the right time is. I guess if you just kind of start at a certain point and you're kind of working with a sense of measure, maybe that's it. You're just working with a sense of measure and not, kind of piling all the ideas you love so much kind of up front. You're kind of laying them out with a sense of order and discrimination. Then I think maybe that's the right time to do it. But I'm not sure how when that time is. I guess there's just some kind of intuitive sense you have to acquire. You have to get as a writer or as anyone who's doing something vaguely creative, that you just have to kind of respect your subject matter enough to know how to deal with it in the right way.
Yes, I think so. I think this is one of those questions where I think we learn by pondering it, but there's never a definitive answer. It's like, oh, that's the $1 million question. If everybody knew when is the exact right time to start a project, then we would all do it.
Yeah. You just have to figure it out. There's no firm, right, clear answer written in stone for sure.
Well, I think this is one of the things too about finding, larger topics, which you're clearly not afraid of. And that...
Oh, wait a minute. I'm really afraid of it. Yeah.
Well, I think, some people take a topic of like, okay, one day in this year, but then that's equally terrifying because then you can find every single thing about that period or a year. But to take something like how to disappear is in some cases, you could go as large as you wanted, or, geography of home you wrote about, or other things that you've written that could also, how do you prevent it from ballooning so large that you never feel like you've fully covered it, which I think would be a risk.
I think in something like this, the given is that you're never going to say everything there is to say. I mean, you just can't. Invisibility, how to disappear. I mean, you could write thousands of words every day for your whole life and probably not cover it. So I think you just have to say, I'm going to talk about it as best I can. I'm going to find enough examples that are different enough from each other to kind of make this interesting. And I mean, for me, writing about this in this book, I was just trying to land on, a number of different ways of being, right? It wasn't about sort of invisibility and technology, although there was some of that, but just, I was more interested in different ways of just kind of being in this world and not being seen. And so whether I showed 6 of those or 12 of those or 20 of those, that's what I wanted to do because, of course, there are at least 200,000 of those, So I just wanted to just talk about a handful of them. But in the first draft, I did have a kind of longer section about how different spiritual faiths look at invisibility. So I was talking about the Christian faith and the Jewish faith and Buddhism, and I was kind of talking about that. And I just felt that one part of me felt like, how can you possibly write a book about invisibility and not talk about spiritual faith and how different religions, look at this and consider this and kind of absorb it into practice. But I just felt, and my editor ended up agreeing immediately, was like, this is too big. This is just way too much. This is too big. You can't talk about human religion in 8 pages or, 20. I mean, you could do a whole book on this. You can't just touch on this. And so we just cut that. And she was really right. I mean, I did, I had these pages there, but it just felt like, it just wasn't enough. And her suggestion that we cut that was absolutely right. And I think I ended up just saying something like, the unseen self or the experience of being unseen is essential to human metaphysical inquiry, which it is. And I kind of left it at that, just right. Because, all spiritual faith does look at that. But, beginning to catalog that was just, was just too much.
Yeah, you can see
So
sort of volumes and volumes growing off of the original idea.
And I mean, I hope that was the right decision. I don't know. I mean, there probably are going to be people who look at this book and say, well, how is it possible that the author didn't talk about this? But anyway, that's why the author didn't talk about it. It was too much.
Well, I think you have a helpful subtitle, notes on invisibility, not the definitive argument on invisibility in a time of transparency.
Yeah, that's kind of that kind of let me get away with it, right? Or I guess I'm hoping it let me get away with it because, what can you possibly do in 240 pages other, on a subject like invisibility than provide notes, right? I mean, that's really the most you can do. So yeah, that's why that subtitle is there.
I think it serves in a way as an important antidote to, there's so much noise that I see everywhere written about, like how you can get more seen, how you can get, more eyeballs on your writing and all of this. I mean, we're reduced to talking about eyeballs, it seems. And to think about, well, actually, what if it's okay? And to honor and acknowledge the fact that some people feel exhausted by trying to make their breakfasts look attractive or all of these things that we do now. That maybe you'll see more by trying not to be seen so much.
Well, I think, that's interesting. Kind of the way I see it is that I'm not promoting myself or promoting personal identity, but really what I'm trying to do here is advance an idea. And I think there's kind of a difference between those two things. So, the idea that, when I talk to you or when I do a reading that I'm, it's all about social visibility is, well, it's just not the way I see it, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think it's about bringing both sides of a conversation to the fore. And I think that it feels to me like recently this side of the conversation has not gotten as much attention, at least certainly not as much as it deserves.
Yeah. I think also it's maybe it depends a little bit on what you're writing about and who you're writing for. I mean, I think there are a lot of, I think you're right. A lot of people talk about the number of eyeballs and, the number of Instagram followers they have. But I think there are other kind of spheres of writing where maybe there's a little less emphasis put on that. And maybe I'm just trying to return the process or return to the possibility of doing it in a more quieter and more private way.
Yes, I think it's essential. There was a lovely image you had early on in the book of a plant that your husband got you that looked like a stone, which I loved. And that the features that you enjoyed about this plant were that it grew very slowly, sometimes without being able to notice it. And that it didn't even really look like a plant at all. And that he immediately knew that it would appeal to you, which I loved.
Yeah, I'm a terrible gardener. I live in the country and, I have many friends who have beautiful gardens and my husband's a gardener and, all of this. And it's lovely. I'm very lucky to have these people in my life, but I'm a terrible gardener and anything ask me to water your plants and, they'll die immediately. So yeah, I had this, my husband gave me this thing that's, called a stone plant because it looks like a little cluster of stones. And it made me very, very happy because it didn't grow and it didn't change color and it didn't blossom and it didn't bloom. And, for me, the idea of a plant that tried to present itself as a stone was just, there was something so, there was just something so admirable about that I just kind of grew to love this plant. But yeah, so that, that little image of camouflage was really interesting to me, that a plant could look like something that wasn't a plant. So yeah, having that on my windowsill while I was working on this book was, constant constant support and reassurance, my little stone plant.
Well, it struck me that the image of that plant, it made me so happy because in some cases, it's the perfect metaphor for the writing process where you can't necessarily see that there's any growth happening and it appears that nothing is changing and that there's nothing moving forward. And yet it is alive. It is alive in there and it's taking its own time to get where it needs to go.
That's very funny. That's true. I hadn't thought of it as a metaphor for the writing process, but I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, this little rock that's actually a plant. Yeah, no, that's great for writing.
Definitely. So if someone listening is wanting to take on a more abstract topic, what would you advise them to do if there's anything that you found helpful to tackle a topic like invisibility? What advice would you give them to start with?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that amazed me when I got to the end of this book was how many incredible visual images there were. I mean, not just in the natural world, for example, but just in art and in film and in literature. Just oddly, for this subject, there were so many beautiful visual images. A Chinese photographer who, Hassan Lu Bolin, who paints himself camouflage to blend into whatever background is behind him, whether it's a grocery store or a library or a wooded, somewhere in nature. So that was, and he's just painted to just kind of recede into this background, and you can just, make out his figure. Or another Chinese artist who photographs bicyclists in the streets of Shanghai, and then he somehow digitally removes the bicycles, so they're still kind of going down the street, but their bicycles are gone. David Bowie walking down the street, sort of undisguised, just, wearing cargo shorts, and somebody photographs him. And he just looks like some normal guy, some passerby on the street. I mean, there were so many, and just sort of was an example of just passing through the world unseen, even though you're a celebrity. I mean, so there were so many visual images in this book. So I think, at least for me, when I'm trying to write about an abstract idea, is it's really important to have something visual to kind of fasten onto, and to kind of be able to represent or reflect your ideas to your reader in a way that they can kind of visually grasp the idea you're trying to express or trying to talk about. Because I think otherwise, or at least for me, that kind of abstract writing without those visual elements becomes very dry and very, I'm not able to pull that off, that kind of abstract writing without the visual elements. So I think, I think that's what I would say. I mean, my first couple of books were more explicitly about design. The first one, Geography of Home, was about rooms, so I would go into different rooms of the house, and then that was the way I would sort of talk about these ideas of domesticity or comfort or privacy or security or whatever it was I was talking about. And then my second book, The Uncommon Life of Common Objects, it was the same thing. I was just talking about, cameras and refrigerators and strollers and cereal boxes. And, these objects became, kind of the entry to, think about, what we value as consumers, and how we raise our children, and how people apologize to each other, and all these kind of other ideas that you wouldn't ordinarily attach to these things. But, so I think I'm just saying that for me, when I'm talking about a more abstract idea, some kind of concrete material image or a place is kind of the way I get there.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I think I can see it helping both the writer and the reader in finding understanding. So. Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. Well, that's the objective anyway. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so grateful you were able to come on and talk to us more about your wonderful book, which I know everyone will enjoy. Thank you so much, Akiko.
Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful. I hope it made sense. It's odd and strange and sometimes difficult to try to talk about the process, but it's been rewarding. So thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Thank you for listening to the Secret Library podcast. The show is produced by me, Caroline Donahue, and Frederick Barry McWilliams Jr., my tireless audio engineer. To get show notes for this episode and all other episodes, please visit secretlibrarypodcast.com. To get updates, literary love, and notification when new episodes are posted, sign up there for Footnotes, my newsletter. And to learn about life coaching with me to work on building your writing life, visit carolinedonahue.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Gold stars to everybody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. We're so grateful. Until next time, happy reading.